Okay, chapter 27. Um, this is still kind of in vein with industrialization. Remember, Europe and the United States of America, the main industrial powers. The last few chapters we're talking about are mostly how the rest of the world is reacting and adapting to this. 19th century Ottomans and China are old world powers, right? The Middle East and China used to be the most powerful centers of learning and economic growth and technological growth, but things changed, and now they're going to adapt to that very harshly. Spoilers. All right, so hodgepodge plan of attack. What are we doing in this chapter? So the Ottomans struggle with modernity, meaning coming to the modern world. And the 19th century is kind of where a lot of historians say we are transitioning to modernity, whatever that might mean. Reforms and resistance to those reforms, to the changes taking place. Egypt will split off. We're going to do the Ottomans in one video, then Egypt in another video. And then finally, the Qing dynasty, China's highest point to China's lowest point. The Qing dynasty is a real roller coaster. At one point, they're going to be incredibly wealthy, one of the wealthiest nations to ever live, and then they're going to become incredibly poor and bankrupt. So they enter the 19th century super powerful. They'll barely be limping out, and we'll do China at the end of this video. All right, so let's start with the Ottomans. And we're going to kind of go through this as quickly as possible here. There's a lot more details in your book. I advise you please read the book. So Ottoman recap. All right, this is all stuff we should know or should remember about. Once powerful and wealthy, they used to control the trade, especially Silk Road trade, as it came through here, and they were kind of like the entry point to Europe. Remember, they controlled parts of Europe, they controlled parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa. They controlled trade. They ended Rome. Remember the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. This basically was replaced now by the Ottomans. Muslim Empire, Turkish, Arab people, Turkish people, European people, kind of a hodgepodge. There were Jewish people, Christian people of different faiths, different versions of Christianity, and lots of Muslims, obviously, in the Ottoman Empire. However, they were usually seen as more religiously tolerant, so on and so forth. All right, failure to adapt. They started to rely increasingly on European manufacturing goods, while Europe was starting to make more gunpowder weapons and stuff. Remember, the Ottomans are one of the gunpowder empires. They're not developing the weapons, but they still need them. They're still buying them in order to stay on the same page as their European neighbors. And so they're going to continually buy these things and buy other manufactured goods as well from France and England mainly. These things are going to move into the Ottoman Empire. That's going to mean that money is leaving the Ottoman Empire and moving on to Europe, and we've already started to talk about that. Next is they're starting increasingly being left out of modern trade routes. Remember, ancient history, the Silk Road, Mediterranean trade, these were the major trade routes of the ancient world. However, as Europeans increasingly use the Atlantic Ocean, were increasingly going to the New World or around Africa, they did not need these trade routes anymore, and so their economic decline is just continual. The Ottomans are just continually going broke. Mid-19th century, they're almost entirely out of the Balkan region. So this region up here in Europe, they had controlled this region, but remember we talked about this before in the Revolutions chapter. Greece and other places start breaking away, and then they're basically losing all of this territory. Now the Ottomans still had a huge legacy in this area still to this day, and there's a large Muslim population in this part of the world, in this part of southern Europe. So they did have a huge influence, but in about the last 150 years, they lose most of all of this territory. All right. And finally, we talked about janissaries before. Remember, janissaries, slave soldiers, but they had total monopoly over the latest and greatest military technology, at least up until this point. Things are going to start changing. But the janissaries were incredibly important because they got to basically pick the next sultan. Remember that you could have hundreds of different princes in the Ottoman Empire, and the janissaries would play an important role in picking who was the next sultan. So that's going to play into, and we're going to talk about the end of the janissaries here. All right, so resistance to reform. So many people in the Ottoman Empire were fearing Russia, and we'll talk about Russia. We already talked about a little bit of westernization and Peter the Great and stuff, but fearing Russia and Russian expansion and growth, the Ottomans welcome in advisors from the UK, and the UK is also fearing Russia. They're involved with the Great Game. We talked about that during imperialism, where Russia and the UK were fighting over Afghanistan. They called it the Great Game, but really it was about controlling different parts of the world, northern India and Afghanistan. And so, as a way of countering Russia, the Ottoman Empire is going to get some support from England. Janissaries at first resisted this change. They believed it threatened their position of power. Who are these foreigners who are now advising the Sultan? We're supposed to be the next, the closest thing to the Sultan. We're the Sultan's private guard. At one point, the Janissaries will actually assassinate a Sultan who they viewed as being too close to the English. So the Janissaries are obviously a threat, and they feel threatened. They're worried that their traditional power, which, I mean, yes, technically they were taken as slaves, but they were powerful, they were rich, they had a lot of political authority, and they were fearing that they were losing that authority, their place in society. Later, a sultan, we don't need to know all their names and details here, we just have to know the general story. Later, a sultan tricked the Janissaries into making a revolt, and he had this revolt crushed down. While the Janissaries were the traditional defenders of the Sultan, right? Well, now a Sultan is going to kill his own Janissaries, and he did it because he was fearing their power and fearing that they had too much stake in the old regime, the old system. And so he, with the help of European nations who helped train his own private new troops, basically, made a private Western European style military using European style tactics and weapons, and he killed all of the Janissaries. So not only did he kill all of them, he killed all of their families and anybody closely related to them, like their friends, any of their acquaintances. So basically wiped the Janissaries out, wiped them out from history, and so they're all gone. Janissaries are replaced basically by more Europeans, and we start to see more European, mainly French and English advisors becoming increasingly important and powerful, especially in the military, and they're in every aspect of Ottoman society. And if you stop and think about this for a second, this should sound familiar. This is very similar to what England did in India as the Mughals were collapsing. As the Mughals were facing economic collapse and militaristic collapse, they started to invite the English more in, the British East India Company, and the East India Company increasingly took over and it was much more powerful until they eventually conquered it. It looks like the Ottomans are going the same way. All right, so mid-19th century, under a lot of European advisement, the Ottoman Empire is going to institute a big program called Tanzimat. Tanzimat is just reorganization. All right, that's all this means. They're going to reorganize. They're going to say, okay, well, what we're doing right now is not working out, so we need to readjust our society. So Tanzimat, try to keep up with what's going on in Europe and the United States of America. They're going to adopt a constitutional monarchy, so they still have a sultan. They still have, a king, basically, kind of like how England's government works. They're going to make written law more important than the words of the sultan. So a constitution, they're going to try to have a written law code, but still maintain the sultan. So they're going to kind of be 1 foot into the old world, 1 foot into the new. Secular, meaning non-religious reforms, take place in all aspects of society. Free printing, press, speech, and religion. These are, you're going to notice a lot of similarities to the U.S. Constitution here. But free printing, press, speech, and religion. So opening up the society. Remember, the Ottoman Empire used to be really restrictive of these things. Only Jewish people were allowed to have printing presses in the Ottoman Empire, but no one else. That's all going to change. Security of life, honor, and property in the Constitution. That should sound pretty familiar to you. Ended the Devshirme. If you remember the Devshirme, that was the special child tax the Ottomans taxed onto their southeast European areas, the Balkan regions, and that the Devshirme is where they created the Janissaries. Well, this is the end of the Janissaries, and so it's also the end of the Devshirme. That system's gone. Postal services, trains, many infrastructure projects like roads and bridges to unite the country better. Schools and universities of Western style and Western design, like schools that are basically copied, cookie-cutter copied out of European and American universities. ID laws and like we have driver's license and stuff like that, social security cards, law reforms, Western style government bureaucracy. This is a big one. Western finance and banking. Remember, in the Islamic tradition, usury, the charging of interest, is illegal. It's banned. Well, now they're going to start introducing Western-style finance and banking, which means interest-based loans, which, like all of the loans that you get in the United States of America or anywhere in Europe today. So they're going to start introducing Western-style banking, and that's going to be incredibly controversial because that's strictly forbidden in Islam. Sold large parts of Palestine. This is where the beginning of chunks of Palestine being sold off to Russian Jewish people who were fleeing the pogroms. Remember, pogroms were in Russia, and we'll talk more about that later in the Russia chapter. Jewish people were under attack, essentially, nationalistic attack in Russia. Many people were fleeing and returning. Zionism was a new idea that was starting to be created, the idea of an Israeli state. And so many Jewish people were turning to Palestine, the traditional area of Judea, to create Israel. And so we start to see Jewish people buying up land the Ottomans were doing this to increase their tax revenue and make money selling this land off. This is obviously going to cause problems in the 20th century, but this is the beginning of it now. Western style of dress is pushed over the traditional, and you see these the way sultans, the way they change their dress. We went from a traditional Ottoman style dress to more European style. You know, they still have some flair to it, I guess, that makes it look more Middle Eastern. However, it's obviously like a European style suit. He's got pleats in his pants, so that's more European style. The swords are European style, and so on. So things are adapting. Conservatives versus liberals, and this is a big issue in the Middle East still to this day in the Islamic world. So religious conservatives argued against social changes and adoption of the European ways. They said, no, we shouldn't have to change these things, right? You want to make all these changes, like getting rid of Sharia banking and other laws. You want to start charging usury for things. And they say you're moving away from Islam and you're making mistakes. And so, like basically, all of Tanzimat is moving away from Sharia law and moving away from his religious law. And they're saying, nah, this is a huge mistake. And so many conservatives, typically older people in society, were against all of these reforms and against Tanzimat. And you start to see throughout the country a big split between conservative and liberal people. Liberals, people who wanted the change. So that's one big split happening. Meanwhile, European imports were destroying the internal labor markets of the Ottoman Empire. It was so much cheaper to buy industrially made clothes and goods or whatever from England or France that if you were a Ottoman person who made like a tailor, you made clothes, you went out of business. Like it shut down your entire economy. Meanwhile, you're buying all of your stuff from other countries, from European and American companies, and so they're hemorrhaging money. Still going to be a lot of issues to this day. Now, many places in the Islamic world, especially in the Middle East today, we're like, well, they're very wealthy places, like Saudi Arabia, and so they have a lot of money because of oil. Well, that's because of oil. A lot of these issues are still a factor in many of these countries, even though oil, which is largely mid-20th century and on, has kind of put them on the back burner. But if you removed oil, these problems would come right back up. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, the military was pushing for Western-style liberal reform and modernization. The military of the Ottoman Empire starts to become more closely connected to Europe than even the government of the Ottoman Empire. And so while you're going to sometimes see sultans who might be more conservative in their beliefs and want to hold on to more power, the military would oftentimes be more closely connected with England and France. And they were more liberally minded and more modernization based and started to become an independent power from the government. This is still a huge issue in Turkey. Turkey's going to be like the successor of the Ottoman Empire, what the Ottoman Empire is going to shrink into after World War I. This is still an issue in Turkey today. This is a cover of Time magazine from 1980 about the military and holding the country together. Just a few years ago, there was a military-backed coup in Turkey that failed. And that's a complex issue there if you really want to look into it. Some people say it was a fake coup. But the military and the government of Turkey are kind of two separate entities. And this started with the Ottoman Empire. So this idea has been around for a long time. In the United States of America, we think of the military and the government being closely connected. The military is kind of apolitical. They don't get involved in political things. If you watch the State of the Union, the military is not one of the people like standing and clapping and stuff like that. They try to stay out of those issues. Meanwhile, in Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, they're much more politically minded. All right, so revolution starts brewing. Sultan Abdulhamid tried to end liberalism and military power. He claimed absolute control. He's like, yeah, we're going to go back to the original way of the Ottoman Empire. I don't like all these changes. I don't like that the Sultan's losing power. I mean, we got to think about this as a legacy. The Ottoman Empire was one dynasty for 500 years. And now all of this stuff is changing, and his family's losing power. The Ottoman Empire is weak. And he says, I know what'll fix the problem. Me. And so we need to get rid of all this liberalism. We need to stop pretending to be like the Western powers. And he tries to take over direct control. He gets rid of pretty much all of the changes that Tanzimat was making, and he starts openly killing liberals, people who wanted to make changes and wanted to modernize Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, rather. Many of these liberals are going to flee to Paris. I say history repeats itself. In the 20th century, you're going to see a similar thing happen with Iran, but basically people fleeing the attacks by their own government flee and leave to European countries. A lot of these more European-minded, modernization-minded people flee, and they start working in Paris for political revolution back in the Ottoman Empire. The exiles in Paris form a group called the Young Turks. Okay, young, and they're Turkish. So they're younger, more liberally minded, and Turkish. So Young Turks. Largely led by a guy named Kemal Mustafa, who will eventually get the nickname Ataturk. Ataturk means the father of the Turks. All right. 1908, there will be a coup supported by the military. A new sultan is installed as a figurehead, and liberal reforms will start to be pushed. Kemal Ataturk is going to be a big leader in this period. Interesting guy. If you ever want to check him out, read these quotes. I think he's an interesting character in history. Um, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories and things about him too that are fun to look into. But interesting. He's just an interesting dude. Had some interesting ideas. So check him out. Yeah. Teachers are the one and only people who save nations. Ataturk. All right. Question time. Could the Ottomans have even survived? Is there something they could have done to hold that mishmash of an empire together? World War One will be the official end of the Ottomans, all right? But other problems were still there. Conservatives versus liberals, that was one of the biggest dividing factors. I mean, the fact that the group that's largely going to overthrow them and stuff, and we'll talk about their collapse more in World War One, but the fact that the group that is leading for all these reforms is called the Young Turks really shows that there's a big divide between the older conservative generation of people and the younger liberals, and these changes are happening very quickly, and changes that happen very quickly are oftentimes very scary. Also, Islam is more than just a religion. You're making all these secular, non-religious reforms. You kind of remember that these are, a lot of people are going to say, well, you're going against Islam. And Islam is not just a religion. It is also an economic system, a political system, a legal system. Christianity, is different. In Europe and America, there were not as many conflicts. Remember, Jesus was on the scene for a shorter period of time. Muhammad was on the scene for a much longer time. And he was much more involved in the day-to-day runnings of the countries and the empire that he founded. So you see a much more developed system compared to a not as developed system. And the European nations had less conflicts between their religious beliefs and their economic and political and legal beliefs and so on. Islam, though, if you're starting to change things legally or economically, you're gonna butt heads with the religion. All right, maybe the reforms are not enough. Economically, the Ottoman Empire is in a weak spot. Right, their trade routes have been collapsing for a long period of time. The Silk Road and Mediterranean trade was not as important as it was historically. They didn't have the resources that were in high demand. So China and India and the New World had resources, and Africa had resources that were in more demand than the Ottoman Empire. And so, you could really look at it and say, like, really, are there any reforms that would have fixed that? How can you fix not having resources? That's a tough problem to fix. Japan's going to be probably the best example of doing the best with what you have. But maybe there was nothing they could do. Next is nationalism. Nationalism had been ripping this country apart for a long time. We already mentioned Greece had split away, and most of the other Balkan regions started to split off. But then the Arab regions start to break away as well, too. Now remember, the Ottoman Empire is this big empire. They were Turkish run. It was a Turkish empire. However, they controlled large areas of European people. Those had already started to split away. But now the Arab people start to split away too. In World War One, England specifically is going to foster the Arab revolutions. The British are going to go to the Arab people and say, hey, you shouldn't be ruled by Turks anymore. There should be Arab countries. And so that's going to be encouraged. Before World War One even happened, though, we see Arab revolts, especially with the House of Saud, which should sound familiar because of Saudi Arabia, right? The House of Saud, who's going to run a revolution to make their own state and carve it out of the Ottoman Empire. Interesting thing. So Saudi Arabia is going to be formed, and today you probably have an idea of where Saudi Arabia is. But remember, this used to be the Ottoman Empire. This used to be all the Ottoman rule. They're going to start splitting it off. The House of Saud, the Saudi Arabians, it is important to note here because we're going to talk more about them in the 20th century towards the end of this course. But they are Wahhabism. Wahhabists believe in a very fundamental belief in Islam. They are fundamentalists, meaning like strict interpretation, literal interpretation of the Quran, and their interpretation. They are Sunni. They are very anti-Shia Muslim and anti-Sufi Muslim as well too. Very much against modernity, very much against secular rule, against Enlightenment ideals, against rights for women. Pretty rough and tumble group of people. However, Saudi Arabia is also, and if you look here, I mean, this is just a political cartoon, but the idea is basically the same. Saudi Arabia is also a very strong U.S. ally. very strong U.S. ally. So they don't have the freedoms that we do. They don't have a lot of our beliefs that we do and our cultural beliefs or ideals. However, they are a strong U.S. ally. And so here's some of our more recent presidents, and just give you an idea here too. Donald Trump's part of the party as well too. One of his first, I believe, maybe his actual first overseas trip was to Saudi Arabia. So they are one of the biggest U.S. I don't know what they're doing here with the glowing globe thing, but it looks very important. But one of his first, if not the first, overseas trip was to Saudi Arabia. It's something that pretty much every U.S. president does. Interesting country there. And we'll talk more about Saudi Arabia in the 20th century. They're a strong U.S. ally. Most of the 9/11 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. It's an interesting relationship. So Saudi Arabia starts breaking away, along with pretty much all these other parts. The Ottoman Empire is crumbling. Nationalism is ripping it apart from the inside out. Oftentimes, when countries and people are successful, they stop questioning and assume they have all the answers. This we're going to see repeatedly. We see this repeatedly. We're going to see it a lot, and we're going to see it really bad with China. But you got to remember, the Ottomans and China and other places believed that they had all the answers. For a long time, they were very rich, and they were very successful, and they're in a traditionally successful, rich, technologically, educationally advanced part of the world. But they believed they had all the answers, and that's a dangerous position to be in, because if you are number one, then why try harder, right? But you got to remember that in life, there's always somebody else trying to take number one from you. And they failed to see the rise of Europe. They failed to see the rise of the United States of America and the change of the world. And so these places, the Ottomans and China in this chapter, are going to decline and become more like vassals, essentially, be forced into almost a mercantilistic situation to these other world powers. So could the Ottomans have even survived? World War I will be the official end of the Ottoman Empire. Could they have survived? Probably not. If it wasn't World War I, one of these other things, if not all of these things, would have torn them apart shortly after. All right, and that's where we'll stop for this video.